Thank you for the very kind introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? What about in the back?
Yeah.
If you have any problem, just raise your hand. Okay? I'm very pleased to be here with the Buddhist Zen Fellowship and to see all of you, some of you old friends. Please help me. Can you remind me what are the major religions here in Malaysia? Obviously, Islam would be the most popular. Number two, maybe Christianity. More than Buddhism, would you say?
Buddhism.
Not important. I'm not interested in the order. So we have Baha'i, okay. Maybe Buddhism, we can fit that in somewhere. Also Hinduism, I'm sure. Any other major religions you can think of?
Taoism.
Taoism for the Chinese, yeah. Sort of Chinese traditional religion. Any other ones?
Sikhism.
Sikhism, okay. I didn't know about the Sikhs. There's one more very important one that no one has mentioned yet. Consumerism. Yes, and I'm quite serious when I say that. I think we can't understand consumerism and the role that consumerism plays in our lives today until we realize that it is a kind of religion. Not only that, I think it is the most successful religion of all time, winning more converts more quickly than any other religion has ever done. Why do I call it a religion? Well, please think, what is a religion? A religion teaches us that, well, let's say, a religion teaches us what the world really is and how to live in it. What's really important about the world. And isn't that what consumerism does? Consumerism teaches us that the world is made up of many individuals who compete with each other for limited money and limited consumption, consumer goods. Really, consumerism teaches us that the meaning of life, the basic meaning of life, is to make money and to spend money. That's what life is all about. And I think it's very dangerous then if we don't identify consumerism as a religion, because we can think that it's actually quite compatible with the kind of worldview and the kind of path that Buddhism is offering. That's not to say that we shouldn't consume anything or that we can get along without money. Of course, we know that these are necessary. But what consumerism is really doing, it's conditioning us to say, again, the essential point, the most important thing is making and spending money. That we are encouraged to find the meaning of our lives in this way. And when I say that it's the most successful religion of all time, well, think about it. Every advertisement that we see is proselytizing for consumerism. Every advertisement we see, whether it's in the newspaper, billboard, television, radio, whatever, every advertisement, what is it saying? It's saying, and there's usually somebody smiling there, right? Every advertisement is saying, if you want to be happy, buy me. So what consumerism is really offering us is an alternative religion that claims to teach us the way to be happy. And the important point from a Buddhist perspective is that this is a false religion. It offers us a path, and it's nice to consume things, but the point is it doesn't work when we make that our religion, because as we know from Buddhism, this is not the way to become happy. In fact, this isn't only something that Buddhists realize. It's interesting that in the last couple decades, maybe the last 15 years, we are having more and more studies by economists, psychologists, sociologists. They are beginning to study what actually makes people happy. And what they're finding is quite interesting, that once you have a very basic level of income to provide enough food, enough shelter, and so forth, but quite basic, quite low, once we have a basic level of income, what really makes people happy is not more income, but rather something else. Can you guess what it is? No guesses? Relationships. Now we all nod, right? Relationships, the quality of our relationships with our relations, with our friends. Yeah? In fact, just when I started this trip about 2 weeks ago, I heard a radio broadcast that it gave the results of a survey. Every year, you have people around the world, they ask people, how happy are you? And from that, they can tell us what is the happiest country in the world. Any guesses? The happiest country in the world, according to self-reported...
Scandinavia.
Sorry?
In the Scandinavia.
Scandinavia? It's a good guess, but it's not right. Anybody? Huh? Bhutan? You would think so, because of gross national happiness. I don't know if they asked Bhutan, but that's not the winner. You might be a little bit surprised. It's a close neighbor. Not Singapore. I wouldn't guess Singapore.
Laos?
Laos? Closer than that. Interesting you say Bangladesh, because Bangladesh usually, it's not the answer this time, but Bangladesh usually rates very high, which seems a bit strange, doesn't it? Because it's a basket case when you think of all the disasters and typhoons and the poverty on that. But what's interesting about Bangladesh is the very tight family structure. Anyway, the answer, I was quite surprised too. 51% of the people in Indonesia reported themselves as being very happy. Again, Indonesia, it's not one of the wealthier countries, is it? But I guess the social structure, the family network is still very tight in most of that country. Anyway, the reason I got started talking about that, of course, is the whole issue about consumerism. And if consumerism is a religion, it's a religion because it offers an alternative way, but a false way to be happy. It seems to me that this is very important because once we identify consumerism as a religion, we can see other religions in a different light, right? That so easy, we think of Christianity, Islam, Buddhism as competing with each other. But when you look at consumerism as a false religion, as a dangerous religion, then I think we can see something different. That in a way, we can find teachings within all the great religions that are basically saying the same thing, agreeing with each other, that the kind of greed that consumerism emphasizes, that this is incompatible with a truly happy life. In other words, I think we should look upon other religions as not competitors, but as allies in this great struggle against the false religion of our age. But here's the interesting question. This is where I think it really gets interesting. Why is consumerism so attractive? Why is it so successful? It's not just that the advertising is so much, that it conditions us, but in order for the advertising to work, it must connect with us in some special way. And I think this is where Buddhism is so important. It can give us some really profound understanding that can really help us see how the trap of consumerism works. And the short answer is something like this, that consumerism feeds on our sense of lack. That we all have a sense of lack, a sense that something is wrong with us, something is missing, something isn't right, that I don't have enough. And what consumerism does, it feeds into that by saying, we know what you lack. What you lack is all these consumer goods. And if you just get enough consumer goods, if you just accumulate enough, then you will be happy. And the reason I think Buddhism has something very special to say here is that it can give us deep insight into where our sense of lack really comes from and how we actually need to address it. So I want to spend just a couple minutes giving you what I think is another way of talking about the most essential teaching of the Buddha. And that this slightly different vocabulary, this slightly different way of talking about it, will help us understand better, I think, the trap of consumerism and money theism. What is the essential teaching of the Buddha? It must have something to do with dukkha, right? Dukkha, because the Buddha said all he had to teach was dukkha and how to end it. But let me check. How many of you know what the word dukkha means? Okay, most people, not everybody. Dukkha is the word usually translated into English as suffering, right? But that only works if we understand it in the broadest possible sense. Not just suffering or pain, but dissatisfaction, frustration, unhappiness, dis-ease. Basically, it's referring to the fact that it seems to be the nature of our unawakened minds to be bothered by something. That's what I think it's really talking about. It means that even those of us who are relatively healthy and wealthy experience a basic something that keeps gnawing away at us, right? Keeps gnawing away, and it keeps us from being happy for very long. And the interesting question is why? Where does that come from? What's the source of this basic dis-ease? So that even when we get what we want, it doesn't make us happy for more than a very brief period of time. Right? And this is where I think this is where the real genius of the Buddha comes in. Because the Buddha not only talks about dukkha, suffering, in the broad sense, but he also relates it to the second most important term in Buddhism, I think, anatta. Right? How many of you know the term anatta? Probably fewer, yes. Okay. Anatta is the word usually translated as non-self. Right. So what's going on here? The Buddha basically is relating the fundamental suffering of our life isn't just when we're hungry or sick, but the Buddha is saying something much more profound that is especially important for us today, that our fundamental, deepest, most problematical dukkha has to do with the fact that we have a sense of self. Not a real self, but a sense of self. And by self, I mean the feeling of separation. To have a sense of self is to have a sense of not self. To have a sense of self is the feeling that I'm somehow in here and the rest of you and the world is outside, you see? It's the feeling that there's two things. The world is out here and I'm in it, but I'm not of it. And what the Buddha is basically getting at, I think, is that it's this feeling of separation. The feeling that there's a me separate from other people. That is the foundation, the most problematical part of our dukkha. And this is where it gets really interesting, because I think today, thanks to modern psychology, I think we can understand a bit more clearly what the Buddha was pointing at. Let me try to say it like this. We all have a feeling of self. We all have this feeling of a me. But where does it come from? When babies are born, they don't have it, right? So it develops. In other words, it's a psychological, social construction. The sense of self is a construct. It's due to mostly habitual ways of thinking, feeling, acting, reacting, remembering, planning, intending, and so forth. The feeling of a me, the sense of a me, it's a self-image created by all of these mental processes working together in a certain way. And it gives me this feeling that there's a me in here and that the rest of you are out there. But in fact, there's really no such thing. If I look for this David Loy somewhere in here, is it behind the eyes? Is it inside the ears? Somewhere in the stomach? Where? The point is, there's no David Loy in here, right? But what this means is that this sense of self, which is a construct, it's not real. It doesn't have any reality or essence or substance. It's just, you can say it's a way of thinking. This sense of self, because it has no reality, because it's a construct, because it's a process, it's not a thing, this sense of self is always inherently uncomfortable. As long as you have a sense of separate self, there's going to be the feeling. There's also going to be the feeling. The sense of self is going to feel never secure enough, never comfortable enough. The sense of self is always going to want to try to secure itself, to make itself feel more real. But it can never do it, because there's no thing there that ever could be real. We're talking about a process. Now, I know this is a little bit hard to understand, but I hope you can see the really fundamental point, that this sense of self is therefore shadowed, or let's say haunted, by a sense of lack, by this feeling that something is wrong with me. And there is something wrong with me. It's the feeling that there's a me that isn't real, that there's a me inside, separate, that isn't real. But this is where the problem, this is where the connection with consumerism happens, okay? So I have this feeling, something is wrong with me. Something isn't right. Something is missing. How do I understand this? How do I respond to this? What Buddhism teaches us is, by meditation, we can learn to let go of ourselves, to realize that we're not separate from the world. And that's what we're doing when we meditate. Buddhism is teaching us that fundamentally, this is a spiritual problem. But the problem in everyday life, especially in the kind of society that we live in now, is it gives us a different answer. For example, to grow up in the United States, I won't say about Malaysia, but to grow up in the United States, I quickly learned what my problem is. What's my problem? I don't have enough money. That's what you learn when you grow up in the US. And you need to get more money, and you need to buy more consumer toys, consumer things. That's how the society conditions us, you see? So there's a fundamental misperception or misunderstanding. And this is what Buddhism is talking about when it talks about ignorance. That we don't realize the fundamental problem is that this self is not separate from the rest of the world, but rather we misunderstand that and we think that what we lack is something out here. It's not always money, it can be many things. Maybe I don't have a job, or my job isn't good enough, or I don't have a girlfriend or a spouse, or they're not good enough, or whatever. It can take many forms, but the important point about our society today, the religion of consumerism, you see, it feeds on this sense of lack. It gives us an answer. Yes, we know what's the problem with you. We know what you lack. What you lack is you don't have enough money and you don't have enough consumer things. And so, if you want to solve the problem, this religion of consumerism, it gives you an answer. But it's a false answer. It's not an answer that can really make us happy. And if you think for example, if you think that money is the way to become happy, it's very dangerous, because you might get the money you want. Maybe you think, okay, if only I had $1 million, then I would be happy. So you get $1 million, but you're not happy. You can't be happy. Maybe if you win the lottery for a few days, but basically it's not going to change you. You still have this problem. You still have this fundamental delusion that you're separate from the rest of the world, that there's a you in here somewhere. So you get your $1 million and you're still not happy. So what's the problem? I was wrong. I don't need $1 million to be happy. I need 100 million, or I need 1 billion. And this is the kind of trap that society encouraged. And of course it encourages people to compete with each other too, right? Does this make any sense? It's not only consumerism. We can talk about other forms. But the fundamental problem is basically the same. That the danger is when we are encouraged, when we are taught that the fundamental problem for us is something outside here. If only I get this, enough of that, if only I get this, if only I solve all my problems out here, then I'll be happy. And I think what the Buddha is really getting at is saying, well, even if we solve all our problems, even if we get everything we want, it's not going to make us happy, because the fundamental problem is this delusion, this ignorance about our true nature, about who we really are and what the world is about. Now, what does this mean in terms of how we actually live our lives? Well, clearly, given the kind of society that we live in, we can't get rid of consumption altogether, right? We can't live without money. And that's not the point. That's not what this implies. It doesn't mean that we can just get rid of money. We know, I mean, even to get here, you probably had to have some transport, right? Your car, your motorbike, your bus, whatever, it costs money to get here. So anything you do, we live in a monetarized world where money is indispensable. And especially if we have families, you know, there's all kinds of things we have to buy. So we're not talking about being pure. We're not talking about being so pure that we escape from consumer society. That's not the point. But what is really important, though, is if we understand the trap of consumerism, if we really understand it, then even though, of course, we must consume, we won't be caught up in the same way. We won't be thinking that, you know, we need Nike shoes or Gap t-shirts like my son wanted, or these sorts of things. But it will give us a lot more freedom. If we understand how our minds work, if we understand where the sense of lack comes from, then it will help us avoid getting stuck in this trap of trying to become happy by getting something that in reality can never really make us happy. Does that make any sense? Now I know it's rather abstract, but that's the problem. You've invited a Buddhist philosopher here, so that's just the way that I think. But I want to go on, and I want to spend the rest of my time building on what I've just said, and how this implies, I think, a different understanding of society, and a different understanding of our economy, and therefore a different understanding of how Buddhism, how the Buddhist tradition now needs to relate to the larger social problems. What do I mean by this? Well, let's be quite frank. We live in a world of great crisis. Things are breaking down. Most obviously ecological, right? And it's not just the climate change or climate breakdown that people talk about. It's not only things are getting warmer, the weather is changing, Some people think that half the species on Earth, the animal and plant species, will disappear within a century or so. We can talk about other ecological problems, economic as well. There's an awful lot of people who now think we have a very unjust economic system, thinking of the Occupy movement, for example, that our economic system, the main purpose is to make millionaires into billionaires, but what about for the rest of us? Yeah? And also social problems. There's a lot of people who are starting to think that all of these problems are interconnected and that we really have to find a new way. And the question is, what, if anything, does Buddhism have to do with all this? Well, remember what the Buddha said. All he had to teach was dukkha, suffering in the broad sense, and how to end it. That's all he had to teach. But the problem in his time was Buddhism, the Sangha, had to be very careful because, as far as I know, none of the Buddhist societies in Asia was democratic. They all had kings, emperors who were very autocratic, right? And they were pretty, they took advantage of the people, high taxes and all this. So this is another kind of dukkha. We can call it institutional dukkha. We can call it structural dukkha. Because it's obviously that's real suffering. But Buddhism couldn't say anything about that. So traditionally Buddhism is all about your own dukkha, the dukkha of your own mind, the dukkha of your own personal life, and it's about transforming yourself, but it hasn't been able to say very much about transforming society, right? This is traditional Asian Buddhism. But it's interesting now that Buddhism comes to the modern world. A modern world which emphasizes democracy, freedom of speech, human rights. There are many more possibilities for the Buddhist perspective and the Buddhist tradition. And this is where I think this is one of the growing tips, maybe the main growing tip of the Buddhist tradition, that we can now use Buddhist perspectives to look not only at our individual suffering, but also to look at the structural suffering, the institutionalized suffering. So specifically, what might this say about consumerism? What does this have to do with consumerism? One way to say it is something like this. You remember that the Buddha talked a lot about the 3 roots of evil, sometimes called 3 poisons, 3 fires, 3 unwholesome roots. Anybody remember what they are? Greed, hatred, or let's say aggression, anger, aggression. First is greed, second is anger, aggression, ill will, and the third one is delusion, right? It's very interesting. The Buddha said almost nothing about evil per se. For him, these were the causes of evil. This is where, and basically what he was saying was, when what we do is motivated by these 3 things, then evil is created, bad karma is created. This was his revolution. This is one of his revolutions, is he realized karma isn't about simply what you do, karma is about your motivation. That when you are motivated by greed, ill will, and delusion, you're going to create problems for yourself. Probably for other people too, but definitely problems for yourself, right? And likewise, if you can change those motivations, if instead of being motivated by greed, it's generosity, instead of ill will, loving kindness, instead of delusion, especially the delusion of separate self, if it's the wisdom of realizing that we are all part of each other, that we're all interconnected, that none of us has any being or any reality that's completely separate from other people. This is the great wisdom. Then when we're motivated by generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom, then it's good karma, then good things, good situations tend to arise. The problem today is that these three poisons have taken a new institutionalized form which didn't exist in the same way in the time of the Buddha. In other words, today we have not only new technologies, much more powerful technologies, but we also have much more powerful institutions that take on a life of their own with their own motivations. And this is a new problem for Buddhism. Please remember, the Buddha says that when we act out of greed, ill will, delusion, bad things happen. Well, what happens if you have an institution that's motivated by greed? That's what keeps the institution going. According to the same Buddhist teaching, you're going to have some very serious problems, right? Well, what is greed? Let's just think a minute. What is greed? How would you define it? Anybody? Somebody is saying, more? I want more, and more, and more. Greed is you never have enough, right? Well, I'm sorry to say that I think that's a pretty good definition of our economic system. It's the nature of consumers. In other words, I believe, I'm going to argue right now, that our economic system today is institutionalized greed. It's institutionalized, you never have enough. Consumers never consume enough. We're always conditioned to want to consume more. Corporations are never profitable enough. They never have enough market share. They're never big enough. And if you look at the national GNP or GDP, that's never big enough. The whole point of our economic system, of course, is that the tendency is to keep growing until what? Until nothing, just to keep growing. The whole meaning of it, there's no conception that we're trying to get to some place where we all have enough. No, the whole point is that there's no end to that process, right? And what we're experiencing today, of course, is the tragic conflict between an economic system that has to keep growing if it's not going to collapse. Because that's the funny thing about the system. It has to keep growing. Once it stops growing, then it tends to break down. It has to keep growing, but we live in an eco-world. We live on a planet that does keep growing. You know, the eco-resources are pretty much stay the same. Very limited possibilities for growth. So that's the fundamental conflict, isn't it? What do I mean by saying that greed is institutionalized? Well, consider, for example, the CEO of a large multinational corporation. And I'm going to call him he. It could be a she, but it's usually a he, right? So let me say he. Now, supposing he has a realization, a deep realization that we are destroying the earth, and this is terrible, and we have to do everything we can to stop it. So he has this big change of heart. He wants to do whatever he can. The problem is, when he tries to restructure the company, if what he's doing threatens to reduce corporate profits, what's going to happen? He's going to be in danger of losing his job, right? Because the stockholders and the board of directors, they're not going to be very happy. My point is that it doesn't matter what his own motivation is. The corporation has its own motivation. The corporation is chartered. It's in the way that it is. It's owned by the stockholders, and the whole point of it is to provide profitability, growth, value, increasing value for the stockholders. It doesn't matter how wise the CEO is. Maybe he could even be a Buddha or a Bodhisattva. But if what he does threatens corporate profits, he's going to be in trouble. Now, please think, if that's true for the CEO, how much more true it is for everyone else in the company who's below him, right? They're going to lose their job even more quickly because they're held to performance standards. The corporation is structured in a way that it has to emphasize profitability. It has to emphasize growth. And it's not structured in a way to reach a certain market share or a certain stock value. It's not as though it gets a certain stock value and then everyone says, that's enough, we don't want any more value, we don't need anything more higher. No, everyone wants growth, more, right? Let me talk about it in a slightly different way. Let me talk a little bit about the stock market itself, okay? I think the stock market is a kind of black hole of moral responsibility. It's a way of diluting and denying our moral responsibility for what the economy is doing to our planet and to our societies. What do I mean by it? Okay, here's this black hole. On the one side, what do we have? We have investors. Millions and millions and millions of investors, right? And the reason they invest, well, because they want to make money, right? It's a very acceptable form of gambling. If you're smart or you think you're smart, you know, you have a little extra money, you put it in the market, and with a bit of smarts or luck, whatever, you will get a return. It will go up. Of course, many of those investors, anonymous, well, let's say it this way. Most of those investors, they're not especially interested in what the company does. They're only interested in whether that company is likely to go up in value, right? That's what they're interested in. In fact, many of them don't even know where their money is because they're in mutual funds and things like that, right? So they trust the mutual fund manager. But all of them are in it because they have certain expectations. They want return on investment. And that's quite natural and it's quite acceptable. I'm not saying that any of these people are bad people. That's the way society works, right? But now, please look at the other side of the equation, or not the equation, the other side of the black hole. What it means is this expectation, this demand on the part of millions and millions and millions of investors, this expectation, how is that experienced by the CEOs of all the big companies? What do they experience? What they experience, of course, is this unremitting, ceaseless pressure for increased profitability and growth. They don't have any choice about it. It's simply that's what they have to respond to. If they don't, then they're going to get in a lot of trouble sooner or later, probably sooner, right, from the board. And also their own stock options are at stake. So all of them experience this great demand, this great pressure for increased profitability, which requires growth. And therefore, all of them are, in a way, by the way the situation is structured, they're encouraged to externalize. Externalize means if there are consequences like pollution that you don't have to pay to clean up, if maybe you can get the government to clean it up, you've externalized that cost, and therefore your profitability is higher. So as much as possible, you want to externalize, because that way you will make more money. So we have this whole system that operates in this way. My basic point is this, or I can ask it this way. Who is responsible for the way this system it needs to grow? Everyone? No one? In a way, we're all connected, right? We're all consumers, employers, investors, pensioners, whatever. We're all very much part of this system. But who takes responsibility for what it does? My point is that we tend to assume that this system is natural. It's just the way, it's the best way, it's just the way it is, and we should accept it. And of course, the media, because they encourage us to be consumers, the media also want to naturalize. By naturalize, they want us to take it for granted, to accept it, not to ask questions about it. Right? The role of the media is not really to inform us or to educate us, because they get most of their money from advertising. So they want us to keep thinking in this way. Can you see the problem that I'm trying to point out? We have not only individual greed, but when we look at the kind of economic system that we have today, we also have institutionalized greed. And to say it again, institutionalized means the system has taken on a life of its own. Not because the people involved are bad, but simply that's the way the system is structured. That's the way the system works. So that today, we have a double problem. Traditional Buddhism, a very important part of traditional Buddhism, is about transforming our own greed into generosity. We can say in modern terms, traditional Buddhism is about undoing our consumerist ways of thinking. Yeah? It means, I think we can see pretty clearly, to be a Buddhist in the modern world, although we're obviously going to consume things, it means that we're not going to understand the meaning of our lives as consumption. But what I've just tried to explain to you is suggesting something much more. That given the kind of crises that are happening in the world right now, to wake up, to be a Buddhist in the world right now, is also to see this institutionalized problem and to ask questions and to realize that this present way that the system is working is not working well enough. It's institutionalizing greed, and that therefore we not only have to work for our own personal transformation, we also have to ask the very difficult questions and work for our social and economic transformation. That whatever awakening, whatever enlightenment we may have in our pushings about our own sense of self, that is insufficient unless we can also become enlightened to the way that the social system, the economic system is structured. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to challenge you. I'm trying to raise questions. I'm saying that we not only need to understand consumerism and work on ourselves, to work on our own greed, ill will, delusion, but we also have to understand how we function in society as a whole. And we have to bring what Buddhism has to offer, the Buddhist perspective, we have to bring that to bear. I didn't say anything about the other two, institutionalized ill will. In the United States, that's clearly militarism. I didn't say very much about institutionalized delusion, but I think that's the media. As I said, they're not really interested in educating or informing us. The media are primarily concerned about keeping us conditioned to understand ourselves as producers and consumers. That's their main function. I think it's really, really increasingly important for us as Buddhists to consider the social as well as the personal implications. And I think I should stop there and we can open this up to discussion. Does this make any sense? Was I clear enough? Can you understand what I'm trying to say? I'm sure that there's an awful lot to talk about. So let's please stretch, sit comfortably, and what do you think? Did I persuade you so easily? Arian looks like he might have a question. I mean this as a pretty serious challenge, you know? mean, if you agree with me, it involves, I think, a pretty significant change in the way that we have been traditionally understanding Buddhism, and also how Buddhism relates to our larger social situation. In America, for example, I can say some of the things that are happening. I'm sure you've all heard about the Occupy movement. We have a branch in Boulder, Occupy Boulder. I've been, to some extent, involved with them. One of the things that the Occupy movement is calling for is a new kind of corporate charter. You see, corporations in America, they've basically taken over the government. You know, they really control the government. It's the same worldview. But corporations, as powerful as they are, they have an umbilical cord. Umbilical cord, the baby cord, you know, for the mother and the baby. The umbilical cord for corporations is their charter. Every corporation has to be chartered by the state or by the country. So, for example, if you have a corporation here in a limited liability corporation here in Malaysia, it has its charter. And what some people are now calling for is rewriting corporate charters so that the corporations not only are responsible to the stockholders, but they're responsible for society as a whole, that they have to fulfill a social role, that they have to be not just good at making money, but good at making society a better place. That's one way to maybe start to transform the system. The other thing in the US is that corporations have a lot of influence on elections, and people are calling for stopping that corporations should have no influence on deciding who gets elected. So there are things we can do to start to transform the role of some of the corporations. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that the only problem we have, or the main problem, is corporations. Greed is, according to Buddhism, it's something in samsara that we're always going to deal with. It's always going to be there. The danger is that we have institutions that institutionalize greed, and that's what we really need to work. That's what we really need to work on. Anyway, I've just started giving another lecture, so I better stop and see if there's any thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
Well, of course, institution is made up of individuals.
Yes.
Institutions.
Right.
And here we are having this illusion created by media, the evil of the society, I would say. So another way of working is through media, because instead of advertising all the time, creating needs, consumerism, somebody who are not conscientious movement to sponsor all this advertisement, to have values. Imagine having Gucci, instead we have nice values.
They have Buddha images or something.
Yeah. Just like you see the meditation image over, the yoga, that kind of thing. If you can use that, that's another way of working to make all the little people be more aware of what consumerism is has become capturing. So that's another way of attacking it, because that's a good call. Because I go to China, they are very good at using banners to promote statements that's good banners, and it's very effective. But that's starting from the revolution, we use that for slogans and all that. I think that's very more effective. If I'm a billionaire, like this channel that, but you can't just keep giving to the poor, because basically the systems actually is very not equitable. So no way you can keep giving the poor. The poor system, as you say, is not functioning to the well-being of all. So that's
Thank you for that. It's interesting, of course, that from a Buddhist perspective, any change has to start with ourselves, right? I mean, what it means to be a Buddhist is you start to work on your own greed before you sort of try to go out and look at social structured greed, right? When you talk about advertising, I hadn't thought about it in that way, but I had thought about it in a different way, that we could have more limitations, maybe get rid of a lot of the advertising, because advertising is kind of funny. Advertisers will tell you that they're just informing us about products, but of course it's not true. The advertising is constantly conditioning us to want. Advertising creates needs and desires, right? And so if we could, as a society, agree to limit, for example, in the last generation, at least in the US, alcohol and tobacco advertisements are much reduced. And that's something I think everyone agrees on for the most part, except those companies. They agree that it's better for society if we don't emphasize them. You also have states like Oregon, Hawaii, Vermont that don't have outdoor billboards. And they're so much more beautiful. They emphasize that because they are tourist destinations, right? So I don't know why we need outdoor billboards at all, really. But one possibility, maybe alternative to yours, would just be to drastically reduce the amount of advertising and instead have more beautiful trees and things like that. And then our minds wouldn't be conditioned, you know, to become